Welcome to our channel. We have breaking news for you about an urgent case. Sean "Diddy" Combs will not be reunited with his family for Thanksgiving. No, the rapper and music mogul, who has been detained at the federal detention center since September on sexual assault charges, will have to stay there indefinitely. Why? Because he has just been denied bail by Judge Aaron Subramanian. Judge Subramanian is currently overseeing this case, and until now he had not made a decision regarding bail. He held a hearing last week, where both sides presented evidence and arguments about why Sean Combs should or should not be granted bail, and we've just received his ruling. I'll go through Judge Subramanian's order now, which was just released right before Thanksgiving, late on Wednesday. The order states that the court has evaluated all the factors it must consider under the law, including the nature and circumstances of the charges, the weight of the evidence against the defendant's history and characteristics, and the nature and seriousness of the risk the defendant may pose if released. The order also mentions that the court has considered the information provided by Combs and the government throughout the 3 bail hearings in this case. As you recall, Sean Combs was previously denied bail by both a district court judge and a magistrate judge. Judge Subramanian wrote that the government presented clear and convincing evidence that no conditions or combination of conditions could ensure the safety of the community, and therefore, the defendant cannot be granted bail. To support this decision, the judge provided the following reasons. First, Judge Subramanian went through the charges in the indictment to highlight the severity of the case. The indictment accuses Combs of serious and violent crimes, including charges of conspiracy to commit racketeering, human trafficking, and transportation for the purpose of prostitution. Judge Subramanian wrote that the indictment alleges that for decades, Combs has abused, threatened, and coerced women and others around him to satisfy his sexual desires, protect his reputation, and conceal his actions. To do this, Combs allegedly exploited employees, resources, and influence from the multifaceted business empire he leads and controls, creating a criminal enterprise in which its members and associates participated in and attempted to commit crimes such as human trafficking, forced labor, kidnapping, arson, bribery, and obstruction of justice. Next, Judge Subramanian wrote that the government presented direct evidence of Combs's violence, including a video from 2016 in which Sean Combs is alleged to have struck his ex-girlfriend, Cassandra Ventura, in a hotel hallway. This was important evidence in the case and was published by CNN several months ago. Judge Subramanian also cited text messages between Combs and one of the victims, believed to be Cassandra Ventura, in which he said, "I have a bruise and a swollen lip. You're sick for thinking what you did was okay." Judge Subramanian also stated that there is evidence showing a serious risk of witness tampering, such as Combs initiating and having unexplained contact with Witness 1, who had been subpoenaed to testify before the grand jury in June 2024 and actually did testify on July 25, 2024. Combs had legal representation throughout this time, and they provided explanations for some of the contacts, but they could not explain all of them. For instance, Combs attempted to call and text Witness 1 even after the witness had already testified before the grand jury, or there were deleted messages with this witness. This is really bad, isn't it? The idea of contacting a witness, possibly before knowing they are a witness for the grand jury, could be an issue, but it becomes even more serious after they have testified before the grand jury. Then Judge Subramanian stated that there is evidence showing Combs violated the Federal Bureau of Prisons regulations during his pretrial detention by attempting to conceal his communications with third parties. We have talked a lot about Sean Combs using other inmates' phone numbers to make calls, using private messaging services to communicate with others, and participating in three-way calls. The allegations are that he not only violated the rules but did so to contact potential witnesses in the case, possibly attempting to influence jurors through a social media campaign. This is really interesting because Judge Subramanian wrote that the court did not make a determination on whether the content of the communications through these channels was wrongful. This is fascinating, and also something he mentioned in the hearing. Whether posting things or having someone post on his behalf on social media is truly wrong. The judge said that he wasn't really focused on the content of the communications. The issue was the violation of the rules, and that's what mattered. He wrote that, however, Combs' willingness to circumvent the BOP, Federal Bureau of Prisons, rules in a way that made it harder to monitor his communications is strong evidence that the court could not reasonably ensure that any conditions for his release would be sufficiently assured, especially when these actions occurred while Combs was seeking bail and knew that the government was very concerned about witness tampering and obstruction of justice. It's really unfortunate that he would act this way while already facing allegations of obstructing justice and being under government supervision. However, this is also very interesting, and another reason why the court is doubtful about Sean Combs being granted bail is that Judge Subramanian at least considered what the bail conditions might look like or what pre-trial release would entail. There was a back-and-forth exchange, and we'll discuss this further in a bit, where Combs' attorneys argued that he had an apartment in New York and would have private security. Yet this is what the court said. The court expressed doubts about the sufficiency of any conditions that would rely on trusting Combs and his team, such as relying on his private security to ensure compliance with those conditions. Wow. It seems the judge was convinced by the prosecutor's argument that Combs' private security team could be easily manipulated. This part is indeed very intriguing. There was an exchange right at the beginning of the hearing that we'll get into in more detail later, where Judge Subramanian asked Sean Combs' lawyers about the distinction you might recall, whether the documents had been taken from Combs' cell. The defense argued that this was a violation of attorney-client privilege. Combs' attorneys stated that there were some papers with the word legal written on them, and the judge raised a point of contention about whether these papers actually had the word legal on them. The judge continued to note that an emergency hearing was held to address the issue of the government using notes on papers marked with the word legal that were taken from Combs' bed. During that hearing, Combs' attorneys insisted that all of those papers did indeed have the word legal written on them. After the hearing, the judge questioned why, despite the defense's claim that the notes in question were written on papers marked with the word legal. The photos taken during the inspection did not show the word legal on those papers. This discrepancy seems to have raised some serious doubts about the validity of the defense's claims regarding the confidentiality of those documents. After the hearing, Combs' attorneys admitted that the papers did not actually have the word legal on them, and they were unsure if the papers they submitted to the court had that marking at the time of the inspection. Judge Subramanian noted that the circumstances of the case and the discrepancies in the testimony during the hearing, where Combs was present, impacted whether the court could trust Combs' ability to comply with any conditions it might impose, or whether those conditions might be violated, either unintentionally or deliberately, creating a threat to public safety. This almost led the judge to suggest that the defense was not trustworthy. Finally, Judge Subramanian distinguished Sean Combs' case from that of Mike Jeff, the former executive of AbadFit, who was recently arrested on sex trafficking charges in New York. Jeff is facing similar charges in the Eastern District of New York, which is comparable to the Southern District in Combs' case. However, Jeff was granted release on a $10 million bond. Despite the similar sex trafficking charges, Judge Subramanian pointed out that in the United States v. Jeff case, although the government had concerns, their primary concern was Jeff's risk of flight. Jeff had no prior criminal record. The alleged crime was not linked to violent acts or gang-related activities like in Combs' case, and Jeff was 80 years old, which factored into the court's decision to allow his release on bail. That's right. Judge Subramanian denied Sean Combs' bail request. After initially filing an appeal, Combs' legal team paused the process to return to Judge Subramanian for further proceedings. However, with the denial now finalized, Combs' only remaining option is to pursue an appeal to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. We conducted a detailed analysis of yesterday's hearing where the judge reviewed arguments from both sides. Let's take a look at our analysis now. This week could be a very interesting one in Sean Diddy Combs' legal saga. Is it possible that Sean Combs could be released just before Thanksgiving? This is a possibility. Previously, I would have thought this was highly unlikely. But after what we saw on Friday in the recent hearing with Judge Aaron Subramanian, who is currently handling Combs' case, it seems this might be more likely than I initially thought. Let me explain. Combs has been held at the Metropolitan Detention Center, MDC, in Brooklyn since his arrest in September. And as you know, he is facing charges of racketeering, sex trafficking, and transportation to engage in prostitution, primarily from 2008 to 2024. He is accused of using violence, threats, and coercion to force women into sexual activities, including sexual acts with male sex workers, referred to as freak-offs. He allegedly ran a criminal organization involved in various illegal activities and violent acts such as kidnapping and arson. We know this much. Two district judges and a previous trial judge have all denied bail for Sean Combs, agreeing with the prosecution's argument that Combs poses a danger to society, given the severity of the charges and the risk that he could flee due to his wealth, power, and resources. He is also accused of obstructing justice by making improper contacts with witnesses and victims in the case. This is despite the defense offering a large bail package, including a $50 million bond, home confinement, restrictions on phone and internet use, a 24/7 private security team for surveillance, and limitations on who can visit him. At the hearing last Friday, Judge Aaron Subramanian, who is the most recent judge assigned to the case and has not yet made a decision on the matter, heard additional evidence and arguments from the prosecution. As we discussed earlier, the prosecution accused Sean Combs in a letter to the court of violating Bureau of Prisons regulations while being held at MDC. Specifically, they alleged that he engaged in unauthorized activities such as making three-way calls over monitored phones, using other inmates' phone numbers to make calls, and using third-party messaging services. The prosecution argued that Combs did all of this to direct others to contact witnesses, even attempting to influence potential jurors. Evidence was presented to support the claim that this was his intention. This ties into the allegation that Combs orchestrated a social media campaign for his birthday, as you may recall, when his family released a birthday video for him. While he was on the other side of the phone, despite being incarcerated, the video presented a cheerful and happy scene. The prosecution argued that the purpose of this video was to influence potential jurors. They claim to have evidence that shows this was indeed his intention, to use the video as a way to sway public opinion and potentially affect the jury pool. There are many other issues related to the bail hearing that both the prosecution and the defense raised, but the best way to fully understand the arguments is to follow what was discussed in the hearing last Friday. However, it's important to note that there were no cameras in the courtroom and only certain electronic devices were allowed in, so we are relying on reports from those who were present in the courtroom to understand what transpired. The first issue in the hearing last Friday was not about bail, but an event that took place a few days earlier. The defense accused the prosecution of taking photos of documents that could be confidential attorney-client information, as well as work-related materials from Sean Combs' holding facility. This occurred after a search for contraband at MDC. The defense argued that this was part of a targeted campaign against Combs, but the prosecution denied this, stating that they were not involved in the search. However, it was revealed that an investigator from the Bureau of Prisons had taken photos of some of the notes from Combs' holding area. Ultimately, after the hearing, Judge Subramanian ordered the prosecution to destroy 19 copies of these photos and prohibited them from using evidence from those photos in their arguments regarding bail. One of the issues the prosecution wanted to highlight was that Combs had improperly contacted a witness, which was supposedly shown through one of the photos of notes. However, Judge Subramanian stated that he would need to address the issue of attorney-client privilege violations at a later time. If there is a violation, it's unclear what remedy would be applied, but Combs' defense team has requested the dismissal of the indictment and even called for the prosecution from the Southern District of New York to be removed from the case. Returning to the hearing on Friday, Judge Subramanian had an issue with the defense. Here's how things unfolded. The defense argued that Sean Combs' notes clearly had the word legal handwritten at the top of the pages to indicate that these were confidential documents, not to be searched or accessed by the prosecution. However, when Judge Subramanian reviewed photographs of 2 intact notes taken during the search at MDC, there was no legal written on the pages. He wanted to know why this was the case and whether the word legal had been added after the fact. This would not look good for Sean Combs or his attorneys. During the hearing, one of Combs' lawyers, Mark Afo, stated that he wasn't sure when the word legal had been written on the pages and admitted that not all of the seized papers had legal written on them during the search. Judge Subramanian is reported to have asked whether the paper you provided me with had the word legal on it on November 1st, the day of the search, and AG Neo responded, "I'm not sure." This led the judge to caution the defense that from now on, they must ensure that all statements made to the court are accurate. It wasn't the best way to start, but that's how things began. From there, we moved on to the analysis of bail, and the main concern for the prosecutors regarding bail was their belief that Sean Combs would not comply with the conditions if released. They highlighted, as I mentioned earlier, the allegations about what he had done while at MDC. Judge Subramanian was reportedly impressed with the rebuttal made by Assistant U.S. Attorney Christy Slavic, who stated that while they didn't trust Combs, they also didn't trust the 24/7 security team that would be monitoring him if placed under house arrest. She argued that one member of the security team was an accomplice of Sean Combs, who had his phone seized, and another was an investigator from the defense team in this case, whom she accused of making contact with witnesses. In other words, this 24/7 security team was working for Sean Combs. In response, Anif, a defense attorney, proposed an independent security team and emphasized that Sean Combs would have to live under stricter conditions while on house arrest compared to his time at MDC. Judge Subramanian reportedly asked Prosecutor Slavic that since she had raised his wealth as an issue in the bail request, should he not be able to use it? This became an important point raised by both sides. The prosecutor responded by arguing that because Combs has wealth, power, and resources to do whatever he wants in society and disregard the rules, he should not be granted bail. On the other hand, the defense argued that they had created such an expensive and comprehensive bail package to mitigate the perceived risks associated with his wealth. Slavic was said to have responded that they were requesting continued detention not because of his wealth, but due to the danger he posed, the flight risk, and his obstruction of justice behavior. Judge Subramanian reportedly asked Prosecutor Slavic to further explain her argument regarding obstruction of justice. While she emphasized the points I mentioned earlier, he also asked her whether organizing a public relations campaign from jail, such as the birthday campaign, could be considered an act of obstruction. Prosecutor Slavic responded by explaining that Combs allegedly stated that he just needed one person, which seemed to suggest he was trying to influence the jury. She argued that this affected the integrity of the proceedings and was an intentional attempt by Combs to obstruct justice. From there, Judge Subramanian moved on to an important point, one that he had advised the prosecutors to be prepared to discuss. This was the recent arrest of former executive Abami and Fit, Mike Jeff, who was charged with sex trafficking in New York. Although the case is in the Eastern District, not the Southern District where Sean Combs is being tried, the charges are generally very similar to those faced by Combs. And guess what? Mike Jeff was granted bail at $10 million. So essentially, Judge Subramanian was asking why Combs should not also be granted bail. At this point, Prosecutor Slavic referenced a letter the prosecution had sent to the court ahead of this hearing. In that letter, they stated, "Okay, it's true that Jeff is accused of paying dozens of men to travel for commercial sex acts and using a security company to monitor and threaten witnesses. But these similarities are only surface level when compared to Sean Combs. First, unlike Sean Combs, Mike Jeff is not accused of engaging in acts of violence separate from the sex trafficking charges, and he also didn't use weapons. They also pointed out that Jeff isn't facing racketeering charges like Sean Combs. They argued that Combs has continuously engaged in obstruction, while the obstruction charges against Jeff were concluded in 2015. Additionally, Mike Jeff is 80 years old, while Sean Combs is 55, representing two different levels of danger. It's interesting because another one of Sean Combs' attorneys, Alexandra Shapiro, chimed in at this point. In fact, she argued to Judge Subramanian that Mike Jeff's case was actually worse than Sean Combs' case. Why? Because the prosecutors are accusing Jeff of running an international sex trafficking ring where the victims were raped and sexually tortured. She also pointed out that Combs, well, isn't exactly young anymore either. Let's shift to another point in the hearing that I want to clarify, which is the story about the infamous 16-second video that CNN released earlier this year, in which Sean Combs is accused of assaulting his ex-girlfriend Cassandra Ventura in a hotel hallway while he was wearing only a towel. Prosecutors argued that Sean Combs attacked her as she was trying to escape, a clear example of sex trafficking, and once again, to demonstrate that he is a danger, a critical factor in assessing bail eligibility. Judge Subramanian did something really interesting when he asked the prosecutor to clarify a point raised by the defense, that the video might not be exactly what it seems, as CNN could have edited or manipulated it. Slavic responded that this was really difficult to understand, as there was no dispute about what happened in this incident. In fact, the defendant admitted to and apologized for this in a public Instagram post. This is true. Combs apologized 2 days after the video was released, and she continued by saying that even if the video was slowed down, edited, or manipulated by CNN, there was no dispute about what the video showed. The defendant shoved, kicked, and dragged a female victim. This is true. In fact, when Subramanian was questioning Mark Agnifilo, he asked about the text conversations between Combs and the first victim in the case, whom we believe to be Cassandra Ventura. While the prosecutor clarified these messages to prove that she was a victim of physical abuse and non-consensual sexual acts, Agnifilo argued that they had additional information to provide context about the relationship and the 2016 video. He said that this actually fits with our view of a long-term romantic relationship with difficulties, but that the breakup was not due to forced sex or sexual assault. He even suggested that there were unwanted physical actions from both sides in this relationship. When addressing the allegations that Sean Combs had made improper contact or attempted to contact others, Ms. Shapiro distinguished this case from others, such as when a defendant tells someone to lie over the phone. She said that this did not occur in this case, and when discussing social media posts, she argued that Combs, her client, had a right to be protected under the First Amendment, to speak out when faced with negative media attacks and to defend himself. Judge Subramanian reportedly asked, "Then why can't he do that through his lawyer?" In other words, why does he need to go through other third parties to do that? Ms. Shapiro was said to have responded, "We are willing to do that, but we are lawyers. That is not our job." Subramanian also pressed her about communications involving victims or witnesses, and she denied that these were evidence of obstruction. She assured the judge that Sean Combs would listen to his lawyers, and if they told him not to do something, he wouldn't. The issue, as prosecutor Slavik emphasized, is that she stated Combs had contacted a witness, someone involved in several sex trafficking events, and he ignored his lawyer's advice when they told him not to carry out a social media campaign around his birthday, but he still wanted to do it. Moreover, while it may be common, as the defense suggests, for inmates to share phone codes to make calls, the Bureau of Prisons regulations prohibit this. The point is, if he doesn't follow the rules in prison, he can't be expected to follow the rules outside of it. Now, this moves to a moment that could be considered both interesting and pivotal in this hearing. This is when the judge asked where the home confinement would take place. Mark Agnifilo stated that it would be in Miami, with a dock but no boat, and the judge responded that this was unacceptable. So where could he be in New York? Agnifilo replied that there was an apartment on the Upper East Side with 3 bedrooms, where 2 guards would be stationed, one on the lower floor with no access to phones or the internet except for calls with his lawyers, and Combs would avoid any contact with anyone who could be a witness in this case. I must say this could be a sign that Judge Subramanian is considering the possibility of granting Combs bail and allowing him to be placed under home confinement. Before trial, the agency ensures that federal criminal defendants appear in court and monitors their activities to ensure they do not pose a danger while outside. A representative from the pretrial services stood with the prosecution and stated that they still maintain the view that bail conditions are insufficient. However, this representative seemed to acknowledge that they had never encountered a case where private security guards were hired for supervision, which is quite unusual. So what did the judge decide? He said he would make a decision on bail next week, meaning this week, and he suggested both the prosecution and the defense attorneys send letters to the court by Monday, which is today, at noon. One of the questions was, what can Combs currently say and what can he not say? Those letters have been sent, and the defense cited the recent case of United States versus Donald Trump when discussing what Combs can say about his case, as Mr. Combs is a criminal defendant and presumed innocent. He has greater constitutional rights than the other parties in the case, including the defense attorneys. when criticizing and speaking out against the prosecution and criminal proceedings that seek to deprive him of his liberty. Therefore, the court should apply the higher standard from the Trump case when considering Combs's statements in this case. The defense also argued that what Combs wants to say is protected by the First Amendment right to free speech. Alexandra Shapiro cited several cases in her letter, and the examples she cited were not related to statements that could influence witnesses or undermine the integrity of their testimony. Mr. Combs has not made any public statements aimed at discrediting the prosecution's testimony or leaking evidence to the media, nor are these statements meant to publicly disclose documents under court order. This is not a case where the actions of the parties are considered obstruction. The government is essentially arguing that a standard should be applied in which the entire media, civil parties, and the government can fight against Combs' reputation, but Combs cannot attempt to influence public opinion in his defense. That is simply not the law, and clearly, she is referring to the numerous lawsuits he is currently facing. The defense argued that none of the examples presented by the prosecution are valid and should not be used as a reason to keep Sean Combs behind bars. So, what did the prosecution say about the bail hearing on Friday? They got straight to the point right from the first page of their letter. The defendant's history of obstruction is an inseparable part of his long-standing pattern of violence over the decades, which must be considered together with his obstructive behavior to fully assess his level of danger under the Bail Reform Act. A comprehensive view of his obstruction and violence, which continues today, clearly shows that there is no way to rebut the presumption of detention in this case. The bail package the defendant has proposed cannot ensure the safety of the community, including preventing his ongoing attempts to obstruct this case, nor does it provide adequate protection against the risk of flight. For all these reasons, the defendant's request for bail must be denied. So, the fact that Judge Subramanian did not immediately deny Combs's bail request, as two other judges have done, and is considering what house arrest might look like, means there is still a possibility he could be granted bail. To be clear, if he violates any conditions once released, he will be immediately returned to the MDC, and, unless there are exceptional circumstances, he will likely never have another chance at bail. Therefore, if he is released, he will certainly have to behave to the best of his ability. This does not mean that the government will refrain from filing obstruction charges against Sean Combs. If there is a superseding indictment based on what he is alleged to have done in MDC, they could still pursue that. Remember, the government has acknowledged that they are submitting evidence to a grand jury in New York right now, and they could also use evidence they consider obstruction not only as additional charges, but also as evidence in the ongoing racketeering charges he is currently facing. If he is released and violates any bail conditions, they could also file additional charges against him. If Judge Subramanian denies bail for Sean Combs, it appears that Combs will have one final opportunity to bring the issue before the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, a higher court. In fact, his legal team previously filed a legal brief in support of his bail request with this court, but then they requested to defer the decision while presenting the case to Judge Subramanian first. And once again, if Sean Diddy Combs is officially denied bail for the third time, that's all we have for you right now on Sidebar. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, make sure to subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or any podcast platform you use. I'm Jesse Weber, and we'll see you next time.